The smell led us to the gates of hell. War has a smell. Every soldier who has ever crouched in a trench or walked a battlefield knows it intimately. It's a foul, complex perfume of violence, a signature written on the air. It's the sharp, acrid bite of freshly spent gunpowder that catches in the back of your throat. It is the deep, loamy scent of torn-up earth, of soil ripped open by artillery, releasing the smell of damp roots and minerals that have not seen the sun in 1,000 years. It's the unmistakable metallic tang of iron from blood, both fresh and old, a smell that is disturbingly similar to the rust on a forgotten childhood toy. It is the scent of human sweat, thick with fear and adrenaline. It is the scent of violence itself, raw and undeniable. But in the spring of 1945, a season that should have brought the scent of rain and new life as weary American GIs pushed relentlessly deep into the heart of a collapsing Germany, some of them, veterans of the most brutal fighting, began to smell something different. This wasn't the familiar, almost comforting stench of a battlefield. This was something else, something ancient and unholy, an odor that seemed to crawl out of the very soil of the nation they were conquering. It was a smell that hung in the air like a shroud, a vile prediction of a horror that no amount of training, no amount of exposure to death could ever prepare them for. For the men of the 84th Infantry Division, that smell would become an unforgettable, searing part of their journey into the war's dark heart. It was the smell that led them, step by inexorable step, to the very gates of hell. The first thing we noticed was the smell. We were still miles away, threading our way through shattered forests and past the husks of burned-out tanks, but this odor just hung in the air, a thick, greasy presence you could almost taste. It wasn't the smell of battle. We knew that smell better than our own names. This was something rotten, something profoundly, industrially foul. It was a stench of decay so vast it defied all logic. We'd whisper about it in our foxholes at night, a new kind of fear creeping into our conversations. What could produce a smell like that? A city full of the unburied dead? A chemical plant disaster? The theories were wild, but none could capture the sheer malevolence of what we were breathing. That smell became our compass, pulling us forward into the darkness. It is what led us to the gates of hell. This story, this descent, is seen through the eyes of one of those soldiers, a young man named David Marshall. He was not a born warrior, not a man who ever dreamed of glory or combat. He was just a kid from New York City, a world of brick buildings, roaring subways, and the aroma of street vendor hot dogs. He was drafted in March of 1943, plucked from a life that was just beginning. He came from a family with no military history, no tradition of uniforms and salutes. He was an ordinary young Jewish American man who, like millions of others, was called upon by the turn of history to do something utterly extraordinary, to leave the entire world he knew behind and travel across an ocean to fight a global tyranny he understood mostly through headlines and newsreels. His journey into the crucible of war didn't start with a rifle, but with bandages, sulfur powder, and morphine syrettes. He was first trained as a medic at Camp Pickett, Virginia. There, in the humid southern heat, he learned the grim anatomy of trauma, how to stop a bleed, how to splint a shattered bone, how to offer a steadying word to a man in agony. It was a skill he'd tragically need, more than he could ever imagine. But the war had an insatiable, grinding appetite for frontline troops, for bodies to throw against the German defenses. The demand for riflemen far outstripped the need for medics. And so, soon after he had mastered the art of saving lives, Marshall was retrained as an infantryman, taught the art of taking them. He was assigned to the 84th Infantry Division, a unit that would soon be nicknamed the Rail Splitters, a proud nod to Abraham Lincoln and the heartland states of Illinois, Indiana, and Kentucky, where many of its men called home. In the damp, gray fall of 1944, the 84th shipped out to Europe, part of the immense wave of men and material intended to crush the Third Reich. In early November, 5 long months after the chaos and carnage of the D-Day landings, Private David Marshall stepped onto the sands of Omaha Beach. The beachhead was secure by then, transformed into a massive, sprawling port, a logistical miracle that fed the Allied war machine. Trucks and jeeps churned across steel-matted roadways where men had once crawled and died. But even amidst the organized clamor, you could still feel the ghosts of June 6th in the air. You could see it in the pockmarked bluffs and the silent, abandoned German bunkers that stared out at the sea. It was a quiet, heavy reminder of the terrible price that had been paid for that foothold in France. Marshall and his unit moved through the liberated towns of France and into the Netherlands, the autumn air growing colder, sharper. They were getting ready for the final push into Nazi Germany. For a kid from the bustling streets of New York, it was another world entirely. A damp, bone-chilling cold was setting in, a cold that seemed to seep into his marrow. And ahead of them lay the German border, the Siegfried Line, and the fires of combat. David Marshall, the medic-turned-infantryman, was about to walk right into it. In the tense, uncertain days before your first battle, you forge bonds that are nearly impossible to explain to anyone who hasn't been there. It's a unique and powerful kind of friendship, born from a shared, unspoken fear and a desperate, primal need for a human connection when you're about to face something profoundly inhuman. You find yourself sharing details of your life with a man you met only weeks before, details you might not have even told your family. For David Marshall, adrift in this sea of anxiety, that person was George Benedict Schmid, a fellow soldier from a different world, a kid everyone just called Smitty. They were two young men, caught in the grinding gears of history, finding what little comfort they could in the small hours of the night, huddled for warmth against the European chill. They talked about home, painting vivid pictures for each other of the lives they had left behind. They talked about the girls they missed, the cars they dreamed of owning, the first meal they would eat when they got back. They talked about everything and anything, all in a desperate attempt to dream about a life after the war, to convince themselves such a life was still possible. But the thought of death was always there with them, a third, unspoken companion in every conversation, a cold shadow that flickered at the edge of their vision. One day, as they were cleaning their rifles, the air thick with the smell of oil and solvent, Smitty turned to Marshall, his voice softer than usual. He made a simple, heavy request. He talked about his parents back home, about how they worried, about the letters he tried to write to reassure them. If he didn't make it, if the worst happened, would Marshall promise to go see them? It was a question that hung in the air between them, heavy as a field pack. Would he find them and tell them what happened? Tell them their son didn't die alone in some nameless, muddy field? Tell them He was with a friend? Marshall agreed without a moment's hesitation. Of course he would. It was a promise made between friends, a sacred pact sealed with a simple handshake. In that moment, they both assumed it was a promise he'd never have to keep. It was a contingency, an insurance policy against a fate they both believed they would outrun. They were young. They were American soldiers. They were both going to make it home. They had to. But that promise, made so earnestly in the quiet before the storm, would become a sacred debt. It would haunt Marshall through the darkest, most terrifying days of the war, a burden of responsibility he'd carry long after the guns finally fell silent. And it was a promise, against all hope, that he would one day be forced to keep. November 18th, 1944. The order came down the line, passed in hushed, grim tones from officer to NCO to the men in their foxholes. The 84th Infantry Division was ordered to attack the German town of Khe Sanh, a key point in the Siegfried Line defenses. This was it, the endless waiting, the drills, the gnawing anticipation. It was over. The low, constant hum of anxiety that they'd been living with for weeks suddenly exploded into the deafening, earth-shattering roar of artillery and the relentless, ripping chatter of machine gun fire. For David Marshall and for Smitty, this was their first minute on a real battlefield. War doesn't ease you in. It doesn't offer a gentle introduction. Its violence is sudden, utterly random, and brutally final. As they scrambled forward, moving from the relative safety of their positions into the sheer chaos of noise and flying red-hot metal, it happened. In the very first minute of his very first battle, George Smitty Schmid was killed. One moment he was there, a friend, a living, breathing person, full of hopes and dreams of home. The next, he was just gone, erased from the world in a fraction of a second, a life extinguished before it had truly begun. There was no time to grieve, no time to scream, no time to even process the raw, disbelieving shock. The world for David Marshall went numb, muted, as if he were underwater. He had to push the horror down, lock it away in a deep, cold part of his mind, and just keep moving. His training took over, a series of pre-programmed actions that his body performed while his soul reeled. Survival is a powerful, merciless instinct. He was a soldier now, and there was no room for a grieving friend. All around him, other men were falling, wounded and crying out for their mothers, for a medic. The medic skills he thought he'd left behind at Camp Pickett came rushing back with startling clarity. He found himself moving with a purpose his conscious mind could barely grasp. His hands applying bandages, pressing down on wounds, trying to stop the bleeding of friends and strangers alike. The battle for Khe Sanh raged on. The 84th pushed forward, yard by bloody yard, taking the town the next day and continuing its relentless advance. They took other German towns with names that would be forever etched in their memory. Beek, Linden. But for David Marshall, those first few moments of combat had changed him forever. In the loss of his friend, he had seen how brutal, how impersonal, and how final war could be. And now he carried the crushing weight of a promise that was no longer just a pledge between friends, but a sacred, binding duty to the dead. The boy from New York, the kid who dreamed of life after the war, was gone, replaced by a combat veteran, forged in a single, searing moment of loss. Just as the men of the 84th were becoming grimly accustomed to the brutal routine of war, attack, dig in, hold, repeat, Hitler launched his last great, desperate gamble in the West. On December 16, 1944, a massive surprise offensive involving 250,000 men smashed through the thinly held American lines in the dense, snow-laden Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. The German attack, spearheaded by elite SS Panzer divisions, tore a huge bulge in the American front. It was a desperate, wildly ambitious plan to split the Allied armies in two and capture the vital port of Antwerp, potentially forcing a negotiated peace. The 84th Infantry Division was abruptly pulled from its own fight and thrown south, rerouted directly into the path of the German tide, ordered to help form the northern shoulder of the Bulge and halt the enemy's advance. They entered an icy, unforgiving hell. The Ardennes, in the winter of 1944, was one of the coldest on record. The snow was knee-deep in most places, and the temperatures plummeted to bone-chilling lows. It was a war against the Germans, but it was also a constant, exhausting war against the elements. Frostbite became as much an enemy as machine gun fire, with thousands of men suffering debilitating injuries without ever being shot. Weapons froze solid. The oil in their vehicles turned to sludge. For the GIs, many of whom were from warmer climates, the cold was a relentless, soul-crushing misery that sapped their strength and their will. The 84th was ordered to secure the key Belgian town of March, squaring off against battle-hardened Panzer divisions. Here, in the frozen forests and across snow-covered fields, the rail splitters earned their reputation in blood and ice. They fought in blinding snowstorms and freezing rain, repeatedly beating back ferocious German attacks. The fighting was desperate, often at close quarters. Artillery shells, instead of burying themselves in the soft earth, exploded in the treetops, raining down a lethal shower of shrapnel and splintered wood on the men huddled in their foxholes below. The cold was a constant torment, numbing their hands and feet, making every simple task, from loading a clip to opening a K-ration, a monumental struggle to survive. Through it all, David Marshall and his comrades held their ground. They became part of the hardened shoulder of men and machines that refused to break, that finally absorbed and broke Hitler's last offensive. By mid-January, the German gamble had failed. The Bulge was being squeezed shut, but the cost was staggering. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest and bloodiest single battle the U.S. Army fought in World War II, resulting in over 75,000 American casualties. The men of the 84th had survived, but they were forever marked by the frozen hell of the Ardennes, their youth left behind in the snows of Belgium. Within the complex machinery of the infantry, David Marshall wasn't just a rifleman. He was a mortarman, a specialist in a heavy weapons company. His main tool of the trade was the M1 81mm mortar, the infantry's personal, portable artillery. It was a simple, elegant, and lethal piece of physics in action, a heavy steel baseplate to absorb the recoil, a bipod to aim it, and a smooth, hollow tube. It was too heavy for one man. It took a whole squad to lug the heavy parts. The tube alone weighed almost 45 pounds, the baseplate another 40, through the unforgiving terrain of mud and snow to get it into position. Its unique power was its high-angle trajectory. Unlike a rifle or a machine gun, a mortar doesn't need a direct line of sight to its target. It could lob its 8-pound high-explosive shells high over hills, tree lines, and ruined buildings to drop almost straight down on an enemy hidden in a trench or a reverse slope. From hundreds of yards away, Marshall's squad could rain down precise destruction on targets they couldn't see. The sound was unmistakable and became the rhythm of their lives, a hollow thump as the round slid down the tube and was fired by the pin at the bottom. A few seconds of unnerving silence as the shell arced invisibly through the sky, and then a distant, satisfying crump and explosion. During the savage fighting in the Battle of the Bulge, this weapon was absolutely essential for digging out the entrenched German machine gun nests that were slaughtering the advancing riflemen. Marshall and his squad worked in a frantic, exhausting rhythm. Get the coordinates shouted from an observer, adjust the angle and direction on the bipod, and then, in a smooth, practiced motion, drop shell after shell into the tube. But being a mortarman didn't mean you were safe, hidden behind the lines. That distinctive thump was a death sentence if you stayed in one place for too long. The Germans had their own mortars and artillery, and they were experts at sound ranging. Life became a nerve-shredding cycle of fire and move. Digging the heavy base plate into the frozen ground was back-breaking, sweat-inducing work, all while hoping that German artillery wasn't already trying to find you, listening for your signature sound. And when the fight got too close, when a German counterattack broke through the lines, those specialist roles didn't matter anymore. In those terrifying moments, Marshall was just another infantryman, grabbing his M1 Garand rifle, fixing his bayonet, and fighting for his life in a frozen foxhole. He endured the terrifying thunder of incoming artillery. He used his old medic skills on his wounded comrades, and he delivered death from above with his mortar. He was a versatile soldier in a total war that demanded everything from its men just to see the next sunrise. After the brutal crucible of the Ardennes, there was no real break, no time for rest and recovery. The Allied High Command was determined to maintain the pressure, to push the German army back across its last major natural defense in the west, the Rhine River. But first, they had to cross a smaller but still formidable river, the Roer. The offensive was codenamed Operation Grenade. It was delayed for nearly 2 weeks. In a calculated act of environmental warfare, the Germans blew the discharge valves on 2 large dams upriver, turning the placid Roer into a raging, flooded torrent. The men of the 84th could only wait and watch from their positions as the cold, grey water churned past, their frustration mounting with each passing day. Finally, on February 23, 1945, the floodwaters began to recede, and the order came. Under the cover of a massive rolling artillery barrage that lit up the pre-dawn sky from horizon to horizon, the assault began. The crossing was a vision of hell, as German machine gun and mortar fire ripped across the water. The first waves of infantry paddled furiously across the swift current in flimsy assault boats. The air was thick with the zip of bullets and the scream of shrapnel. Boats were hit, splintering apart, spilling men and equipment into the freezing, fast-moving river. But the 84th, by skill or by luck, hit a seam between 2 German units and managed to establish a small but vital bridgehead on the far bank. For the entire first day, the infantry fought alone, without tank support, battling their way through a labyrinth of fortified positions in the mud and the relentless, chilling rain. Despite the fierce and desperate resistance, the rail splitters pushed forward, clawing their way inland. They drove across the flat, open Cologne plain, taking town after town in a grueling advance. By March 5th, less than 2 weeks after that desperate river crossing, they had done it. They had reached the west bank of the Rhine River. The German army west of the river was shattered, broken. For the GIs of the 84th, exhausted and battle-worn, standing on the banks of Germany's most iconic and legendary river, felt like the beginning of the end. Victory felt palpable, almost within reach. But as they prepared to cross into the German heartland, they were advancing into a territory that held a secret far darker, far more depraved than any battlefield they had yet seen. After crossing the Rhine on April the 1st, the 84th Division drove deep into the collapsing Reich. The end of the war in Europe felt tantalizingly close. The once mighty German war machine was crumbling, its armies in the west in full retreat or surrendering in droves. For the soldiers, it was a grim, weary push to the finish line, a relentless advance through a landscape of ruin. It was during this final advance, as they moved eastward toward the major city of Hanover, that the men began to notice it. At first, it was faint, just another foul odor, carried on the spring wind, easily dismissed amidst the other smells of a country being torn apart by war. But as they pressed on, day by day, mile by mile, the smell grew stronger, more pervasive. This was different. Combat veterans are connoisseurs of stench. They know the coppery, metallic smell of fresh blood, the sick, cloying sweetness of gangrene from a festering wound, the acrid, chemical bite of gunpowder, and the heavy, unforgettable odor of human bodies left too long in the sun. This new smell was all of those things, and yet it was none of them. It was rot, filth, and burning on an unbelievable industrial scale. It was the smell of so much concentrated human suffering that it became a physical presence, a foul, invisible cloud that saturated the air for miles around, a miasma of death. The GIs talked about it in nervous, hushed whispers during their brief halts. What in God's name was it? A chemical factory that had been bombed? The aftermath of a massive, unreported battle? A city where the dead lay unburied in every street? The smell was an omnipresent mystery, and it filled them with a creeping, formless dread. It didn't smell like the clean, sudden death of the battlefield they knew. This was the odor of slow, methodical, systematic decay. It was a smell that seemed to have weight, that clung to their uniforms and their hair, a foulness that tainted the taste of their rations and their water. The closer they got to Hanover, the more overpowering and inescapable the stench became. They were no longer just following maps and coordinates from headquarters. They were following the smell, drawn forward by this ghastly olfactory compass. On April 10th, 1945, elements of the 84th Division fought their way into and captured the city of Hanover. But the mission wasn't over. Guided by that horrific, inescapable odor that now permeated everything, a detachment of soldiers, including Private David Marshall, was drawn to a specific location on the city's outskirts. They followed the stench down a road that led them to a high barbed wire fence and a gate. A sign identified the place, Hanover Alum. This was the source of the smell. This was a concentration camp, a sub-camp of the larger Neuengamme network. The camps weren't military targets. They didn't appear on Allied tactical maps. Most American soldiers, Marshall included, had no real concrete idea what they were. They'd heard rumors, of course, stories of German brutality, but in the cynical mindset of a combat soldier, Most of it was dismissed as propaganda, the kind of stories every army tells about its enemy. The reality they were about to discover was beyond their most fevered imagination. The SS guards had already fled, forcing about 600 of the healthier prisoners on a final, brutal death march toward the Bergen-Belsen camp. They simply abandoned the ones too sick or too weak to move, leaving them to die. What Marshall and his comrades saw when they walked through those gates was a scene from a medieval painter's vision of hell, brought to life in the 20th century. The prisoners who remained were barely human. They were walking skeletons, draped in filthy striped rags, their bodies withered to nothing but skin and bone. They stared out from skeletal faces, dominated by huge, vacant eyes that seemed to hold all the suffering of the world. They were too weak, too dehumanized, too brutalized by years of torment to even understand that these new soldiers in different uniforms weren't new tormentors, but liberators. The ground was littered with the dead and the dying, indistinguishable from one another. The filth was unimaginable, and the overpowering stench of excrement, disease, and decaying flesh made hardened combat veterans, men who had seen and smelled death in all its forms, gag and vomit. For David Marshall, a Jewish American, this moment changed everything. The war suddenly snapped into a terrifying new focus. This wasn't just a war against an enemy army over territory and politics. This was a war against an enemy that wanted his entire people, his heritage, his family, his very existence wiped from the face of the earth. The abstract evil he'd been fighting for 2 years was now laid bare in its most grotesque, tangible, and undeniable form. He was staring into an abyss, filled with the emaciated, brutalized bodies of his people. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower would later issue a famous order, insisting that as many soldiers as possible be brought to see these camps, to be given first-hand evidence of these things, if ever. In the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. For David Marshall, no order was needed. The sight, the sounds, the smell were burned into his soul forever. This, he now knew with chilling certainty, was what they were truly fighting against. The soldiers' first reaction was a stunned, horrified shock, followed by a desperate, overwhelming human urge to do something. They were men trained for structured violence, for taking objectives and killing the enemy. They had no training for this. A humanitarian crisis so profound it defied any military protocol. They rushed to offer the only comfort they had, their own sea rations, their precious bars of chocolate, their cigarettes. It was a natural, compassionate impulse to feed the starving. But their good intentions, born of shock and pity, sometimes did more harm than good. A body ravaged by systematic starvation for years on end cannot handle rich, complex food. Some of the survivors they tried to help became violently ill, their shattered digestive systems going into shock. In the middle of this chaos of good intentions and tragic consequences, David Marshall saw something so profoundly, cruelly tragic that it would come to define the entire experience for him. A survivor, a skeletal man whose age was impossible to guess, was offered a piece of food by a GI. He took it with a trembling, bony hand, and for a fleeting moment, a flicker of light, of life, appeared in his hollow eyes. He was free. The Americans were here. The nightmare was over. He brought the food to his lips, putting a small taste of freedom, of a normal life, on his tongue, and in that very moment, His body, which had miraculously held on through years of unimaginable torment, beatings, and starvation, just gave out. He collapsed and died right there at the feet of his liberators. He had survived everything. He had survived the beatings, the slave labor, the starvation, the death marches. He had endured to the very edge of liberation, had lived long enough to see the faces of free men, and he died with the taste of freedom on his tongue. It was a final, devastating cruelty that spoke volumes about the nature of the evil they had uncovered. For Marshall and the other GIs, it was a terrible, swift lesson. They could kill the guards and break down the fences, but they couldn't just undo the evil that had been done. They could not command a body that had been systematically destroyed to simply be whole again. The true nature of their enemy was revealed in that moment. Their evil was a poison that kept on killing, a darkness that lingered long after they were gone. The discovery of the camps, Arlem, and then others like Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen sent a profound shockwave through the Allied armies. What the liberators found was so profoundly horrific, so far beyond the pale of human behavior, that General Eisenhower himself ordered cameras and journalists to be brought to the sites immediately. He wanted the mountains of emaciated corpses, the ovens, and the walking skeletons documented from every angle. He knew, with a chilling prescience, that a crime this enormous, this unbelievable, would one day be questioned or even denied. He wanted irrefutable photographic proof for posterity. He also ordered soldiers to be brought from rear echelon units, men who had not seen heavy combat, to tour the camps. He wanted them to see, to smell, to feel the reality of what they were fighting against. For the liberators themselves, the experience was deeply and permanently scarring. These were young men who had already been through the hell of combat. They had seen death up close. But this was different. This wasn't the tragic but understandable violence of war, of soldier against soldier. This was the methodical, bureaucratic, industrial extermination of helpless human beings. As one veteran would later say, "I had seen men die before. I had seen horrible things, but I had never seen men stacked up like cordwood." The sheer scale of the cruelty, the calculated degradation of human life, shattered their understanding of the world. For David Marshall, it resonated even deeper, striking a chord of personal horror. As a Jewish American soldier, he wasn't just a liberator, he felt a profound, terrible connection to the victims. The GI Jews, as they were sometimes called, found themselves in a unique position. They could often speak Yiddish with the survivors, becoming a living bridge between the broken, shattered world of the camps and the world outside. They found themselves leading impromptu prayers for the dead, their American-accented Hebrew and Yiddish mingling with the whispered prayers of the survivors in a shared language of grief and heritage. In those moments, they weren't just soldiers. They were family, arriving at the last possible, desperate moment. The psychological toll on these men was immense. Many liberators couldn't speak about what they saw for decades, locking the memories away in a place no one could touch. The sights of the bodies, the sounds of weeping, and especially that smell, were imprinted on their minds forever. They had borne witness to the ultimate consequence of unchecked hatred, and that knowledge was a heavy, silent burden they would carry for the rest of their lives. The war in Europe officially ended in May of 1945. The thunder of artillery and the rattle of machine guns were replaced by a strange, unaccustomed silence. For the millions of soldiers, the end of the fighting was the beginning of the long journey home. Not just a journey across an ocean, but a more difficult internal journey back from the men they had been forced to become. For David Marshall, amidst the joy and relief, there was one last mission to complete. It wasn't an official order from a commanding officer, but a solemn duty he'd carried in his heart since his very first minute of combat. It was the promise he had made to Smitty. After returning to the United States and being discharged from the army, Marshall found the address for the Schmid family. He traveled to their home, a young veteran in civilian clothes, carrying the immense weight of his friend's last moments. He knocked on their door, his heart pounding. Smitty's parents, an older couple whose faces were etched with a quiet grief, welcomed him in. With a heavy heart, in the quiet of their living room, Marshall told them about their son. He didn't spare them the hard truths, but he told them with compassion. He told them about their friendship, about the talks of home, and about Smitty's courage. He told them what happened in those first chaotic, violent moments of the attack. And he told them, fulfilling the most important part of his promise, that their son had not been alone when he died. There is no way to truly comfort a parent who has lost a child to war. But David Marshall's visit provided something invaluable, something a government telegram could never offer: a connection, a final report from a human face who had known and cared for their son. He gave them the gift of knowing. The Schmid family embraced him, this young stranger who had carried the memory of their son all the way home from Germany. That visit forged a lifelong bond between the young veteran and the Gold Star parents. His promise, born in the tense quiet before a battle, was finally fulfilled. It was a small, quiet act of remembrance and decency that closed a chapter of his war, a testament that even in a conflict that had revealed the absolute worst of humanity, small acts of loyalty and love could still survive. David Marshall's story is just one of millions from the Second World War. The experiences of the men of the 84th Infantry Division and all the soldiers who became the liberators of the Nazi concentration camps are a vital, sacred part of our collective history. Their testimony, what they saw, what they smelled, what they felt, is our most powerful weapon against the erosion of time and the poison of denial. To learn more about these stories, to see the faces and hear the voices of the liberators and the survivors, please consider visiting the online resources of institutions like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the National Wadiyawu Museum. They are dedicated to the solemn task of making sure that we, as a civilization, never forget. David Marshall's journey is a journey through the very heart of the 20th century. It is the story of an ordinary man from an ordinary place who endured the hell of frontline combat and was then forced to confront an evil so profound it defied all prior imagination. His experience is a powerful, essential reminder that behind the sweeping arrows on military maps are individual people, bound by promises, burdened by loss, and haunted by memories. The liberation of the Nazi camps was not a triumphant victory parade. It was a horrifying, traumatic discovery that forced the world to look directly into the abyss. The soldiers who broke down those gates became the unwilling, first-hand witnesses to a crime so vast it gave us a new and terrible word: genocide. They finally saw, in the most visceral way possible, as General Eisenhower had said, what they were fighting against. The smell that led them to Alem was more than just the physical odor of death. It was the stench of an ideology, a philosophy of hatred that was allowed to fester, to grow, and to be weaponized until it consumed millions of innocent lives. The memory of that smell, of the skeletal faces of the survivors, and of the man who died with the taste of freedom on his tongue, is a warning. It is a stark reminder that civilization is fragile, that the veneer of humanity is thin, and that we must remain ever vigilant. We have a duty to listen to the stories of the liberators and the survivors. We must bear witness, just as they did. We must remember, because memory is the only true liberation from the past.